Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Marvin Kalb, Director of the Shorenstein Center on Press, Politics, and Public Policy here at the Kennedy School. And it's my pleasure to introduce Sidney Blumenthal tonight. This event is co-sponsored by the Shorenstein Center, the Democratic Caucus for the Kennedy School, the Democratic Caucus for the University, and a few other Democrats. Sidney Blumenthal is 49 years of age. Doesn't look. He is a writer with a list of impressive credentials, having worked at different times for The New Yorker, The New Republic, The Washington Post, and Vanity Fair. He's written 5 books, including The Permanent Campaign, which contributed mightily to our understanding of contemporary politics. He's even written a play that pokes fun at the White House press corps. So far, so good. But Sidney Blumenthal is also one of the most controversial figures to hit Washington, D.C. in a long time. Since August of last year, Blumenthal has been a special advisor to the President of the United States, a speechwriter on subjects such as Iraq and other foreign and domestic policy problems, and the highly regarded State of the Union address. He's also said to be close to the First Lady, speaking to her every day about a wide range of issues. He has felt the sting of the internet when Matt Drudge, who has his own page in that strange new world, described Blumenthal as being guilty of spousal abuse, of all things, a charge Blumenthal denied and Drudge quickly withdrew. But Blumenthal demanded to know his sources and launched a $30 million defamation suit against Drudge. Blumenthal has also become absorbed in the Monica story. On February 26th, being summoned to Kenneth Starr's grand jury proceedings to provide the names of reporters and news organizations he talked to about the case. When Blumenthal emerged that day, he proudly declared, "If they think they have intimidated me, they have failed." Blumenthal is also a former journalist who is often criticized by other journalists. Maureen Dowd of The Times referring to him as supercilious Sid, and Newsweek accusing him of smug toadying. What all of that suggests is that Sidney Blumenthal is one of those modern Washington figures who can zip through the revolving doors of press and politics and leave everyone confused about his ultimate professional loyalty. However, there is no confusion about his political loyalty, which goes from his heart and his head directly to Bill and Hillary Clinton, who happen to inhabit that big White House on Pennsylvania Avenue. So it's my pleasure to introduce Sidney Blumenthal, who is here to discuss the Clinton presidency and the future of America. Sid.
Well, thank you, Marvin. It's good to be here with old friends, even old neighbors, colleagues. It's a little bit like this is your life. I lived here a long time. And I should add, given that all the Democratic clubs are co-sponsoring this event, welcome, fellow Democrats. It's a special pleasure for me to be back here in this forum. The last time I was here, a year and a half ago, it was in a very different role as a playwright, to watch the performance of my play, This Town, an absurd comedy about a scandal-obsessed capital. That, of course, was sheer fantasy. Now that, at least for now, I'm not a playwright or a journalist or an author, but the assistant to the president, I can tell you that even the most imaginative art cannot rival life, from the sublime to the ridiculous. Sublime first. A week ago, I sat in the chamber of the Chilean Congress as President Clinton delivered an address extolling democracy as the highest value. Above all, he said, Augusto Pinochet, the former dictator, now senator for life, boycotted the president's speech, and his supporters sat on their hands. In Chile and throughout Latin America, Although every government but one is elected, democracy remains a paramount issue. So the president's speech was a signal event in Chilean politics and in the hemisphere. There was a personal resonance for me also at this event. More than 20 years ago, when I was a young journalist in Boston, I met a Chilean exiled leader who was at Harvard at the time, interviewed him. It was one of my very early articles. And I ran into him there. He was a senator. He sat in the front row of the Chilean Congress while I sat across the aisle in the American delegation. Now they're ridiculous. A couple of months ago, I was waiting in the corridor outside the grand jury room for my turn to answer Ken Starr's questions. I noticed that Terry Lenzner, the former Watergate deputy counsel and now a private investigator working for Democrats, was also waiting. We'd never met. I observed to him that, though we had a number of friends in common, it had taken Ken Starr to make a proper introduction. Then I was called into the grand jury room. Among the questions, have you ever met Terry Lenzner? And finally, have you ever said anything positive about Ken Starr? I paused and replied, I can't recall. The antics of Washington may appear like those of a hothouse theater in which many of the actors who speak their hurried lines have little sense of the drama's meaning. But these events are not beyond our comprehension, and the issue of democracy abroad, as I hope to make clear, is not far removed from its fate at home. In Washington, the chief riddle of the day is this: why is President Clinton popular? To opponents, the question itself is inexplicable. But in fact, President Clinton has been more popular over a longer period of time than Ronald Reagan ever was. Why is this so? Some contend that it marks a sea change in culture, a transformation of American values, perhaps, for the theoretically inclined, the latest manifestation of the cultural contradictions of capitalism. But there is another, less opaque way to approach the problem. What has President Clinton achieved? And what kind of future are we preparing for our nation? Once we look at the question from these angles, it may be apparent that the Clinton presidency has struggled through a difficult transitional period, met and mastered many of its challenges, and established, at the turn of a new millennium, the makings of a new era. It is often hard to gain perspective on the present through the swirl of controversy and contention. The past may be felt to be more familiar, certain and reassuring. Soothing nostalgia and wishful thinking, after all, were animating elements of Reaganism. But the Clinton presidency has a different, more practical and ambitious mission: to make America a modern nation. The administration's policies have reshaped the economy, reformed the instrument of government, and recast progressive politics. These actions have been of the time, by the time, for the time. They have not proceeded from dogmas or, least of all, nostalgia. The president's policies have been remedial, preemptive, and reconstructive all at once. The lead weights of the past have been thrown off in order to move forward, not to regress to a dream time. No progressive model of politics can avoid changing along with society and the economy. The modern imperative is to shape our interests and values to new realities. The governing idea of the Clinton presidency is the idea of the nation, not who we imagine we were, but who we might become. The goal is to create a new social contract for a global economy in which opportunity is widened, in which fiscal discipline fosters confidence in a government able to invest in education, the environment, child care, and health care, in which civil society social harmony and public safety are restored, and in which a multicultural people can forge a common identity. If there is a name for the Clinton approach as a politics, it is this: one nation politics. And this is the cynosure of the new social contract. The 1997 Balanced Budget Agreement that included new health coverage for 5 million children and the creation for the first time of tax tuition credits for everyone to attend college, the Hope Scholarships. For the first time in more than a generation, we have the means to meet our ends, the capabilities to realize our purposes. We see surpluses as far as the eye can see, in the words of Gene Sperling, the director of the National Economic Council. The Clinton administration has restored solvency, and not merely in the fiscal sense. We are able again to think about how we can shape our society and to conduct a practical politics around our ideas. Creating the new nation, the American nation at the turn of the new century, the 21st century, is a project that is just beginning. But one nation politics, the method of modernization, is rooted in a traditional concept. The great object of the institution of civil government, President John Quincy Adams declared in 1825 in his first annual message to Congress, is the improvement of the condition of those who were parties to the social compact. For the Clinton presidency, this project, a great project that falls to every generation, has not been easy. It has required confronting the burdens of the past and struggling with hostile forces that seek to confound and destroy one nation politics and all that it promises. On the eve of his inauguration in December 1992, President-elect Clinton was informed by the outgoing director of the budget that the federal deficit had been miscalculated and was about $60 billion more than previously estimated. It was expected to rise to $357 billion by 1997. Since Reagan's supply-side tax bill was passed in 1981, based on the panacea that cutting taxes and increasing spending would miraculously lead to a balanced budget, progressive social policy had been blocked. David Stockman, Reagan's early budget director, acknowledged in an interview with me for The New Yorker that once the policymakers recognized that an astronomical deficit had been produced, it had the consequence of paralyzing government, an outcome that confirmed the conservative view that government was and should be ineffectual, and solidified the Republicans politically. And there were deficits as far as the eye could see. At the start, the prospect of coping with the deficit seemed as if it would completely thwart President Clinton. His plans would never materialize. He would be absorbed in remedial activity forever. Then the political conditions that had plagued the Democrats since 1968 would be reproduced. From the agony of 1968 onward, when the Democrats disintegrated politically, the troubles for recreating a progressive politics only increased. The election of 1980 was filled with recurrences of the indictments of 1968. The standing negative in the year of Reagan's victory was identical in argument to that of 68, but added to the foreign policy indictment and the party strife indictment were the indictments that the Democrats couldn't run the economy and couldn't express the national temperament, its optimism. It was malaise deluxe. On the eve of the 1992 election, it appeared that even in the midst of recession, the burdens the Democrats carried were becoming heavier. There were still deficits as far as the eye could see. The tools of governance were left to rust. Government, it was said, couldn't rise above the deficit. The only appropriate role of government was to stand aside. The issue of government, and therefore of politics, was settled. The assumption was that the Democrats could gain and hold the presidency only if unusual circumstances created an ephemeral breach in the wall of Republican dominance. George Bush's failure to fill the evanescent image of Reagan by surmounting the recession, a resultant part of Reaganism, seemed to create that breach. But something more than an aberration was possible. The ending of the Cold War had profoundly shifted the tectonic political plates that had been in place for more than a half century. Even more, the end of the Cold War was an abrupt conclusion to the 20th century of total war, the age of extremes, as the historian Eric Hobsbawm put it. In 1990, in my book, Pledging Allegiance, I wrote, "The ancient questions that had been closed for decades were now reopened. But one question strangely went unasked, the American question. Just as the Cold War beginning had radically transformed American politics, so would its ending." For nearly 6 years now, President Clinton has been remaking progressive policy and politics while in office. The new economy, of course, depends upon the initiative of entrepreneurs and the energy of workers, but it would not have been able to flourish unless a new framework of policy had been set in place. The 1993 deficit-reducing budget of President Clinton, for which the Democrats paid a steep price in 1994, was essential, an unquestioned factor, according to Federal Reserve Chairman Alan Greenspan, whose appointment, by the way, was itself another act of policy. The anxious class, identified by Secretary of Labor Robert Reich, has begun to see anxiety lessened and opportunities widened. For 20 years, average family income stagnated and real wages declined. But since 1993, family income has risen more than $2,000, and last year, real wages increased 2.3%. The minimum wage, championed by the administration, and the earned income tax credit have ensured that the benefits of the economy have spread to the working poor. By 1996, 4.3 million people were lifted out of poverty by the earned income tax credit. The poverty rate is down. It's not nearly enough, but we can begin to see a new social contract at work. The current Republican Congress, however, cannot decide how to deal with the president's new approach. As it has lost its ideological and programmatic thrust and focus since 1994, it has become even more partisan. This may be one more sign of the acceleration of history. Now Republicans can choose to play a constructive role of working with the president, or they can resist, voting down 100,000 new teachers and new school construction, as they did this week. They can act as tools of special interests, the tar and nicotine of the old politics, as Speaker Newt Gingrich did this week in joining the tobacco companies in assailing an effort to reduce teen smoking and support children's health. They can follow a strategy of trying to tear down the president as a way to build themselves up. But as Senators D'Amato and Thompson have discovered, that approach has only backfired for them. Dan Burton, however, for his part, can't crawl out of this hole because it is his natural habitat. The Congressional Republican Party today is so fractured that it must stand still to avoid breaking apart. Its fear of movement, especially forward, expresses itself as a policy of general immobilism tending toward shutdown. And this policy is not restricted to the domestic arena. With the end of the Cold War, the internationalism that marked the bipartisan consensus on America's role in the world has eroded. Old forms of nativism, xenophobia, and isolationism have emerged from under the rocks. The moment when the United States is at the zenith of its economic, military, and political power in all its history, the very idea of internationalism is being challenged as it has not in decades. For example, when United Nations weapons inspectors were at risk in Iraq and the International Monetary Fund was intervening to stabilize Asian economies, a handful of Republicans tied IMF funding and the payment of U.S. dues to their anti-family planning agenda. Rather than debate family planning on its merits, they used it to hold U.S. foreign policy hostage. This is more than a dangerous precedent. It is entirely possible that the U.S. could lose its vote in the General Assembly of the United Nations this year for non-payment of our debt. Entirely possible. We are, as never before, the indispensable nation, but our strategy to gain adherence to the standards of democracy, global prosperity, and peace means we must act along with others who share the risks and burdens of leadership. In Latin America, from where I returned last week, the U.S. advanced an agenda for a second generation of democratic reforms to protect a free press, train an independent judiciary, promote education. Elections are only one part of democracy, and institutions that involve an active citizenry must be built up. As the President pointed out in Santiago, economic growth cannot be long sustained without democratic development, including raising the living standards of the poor. With Great Britain, we have forged a new special relationship, a 21st century alliance, as the President has called it, based not only on our traditional mutual interests, but on our common conviction in the necessity of a new social contract. This is an entirely new basis for the relationship. Since last November, when First Lady Hillary Rodham Clinton and I traveled with an American delegation to meet with a British delegation chaired by Prime Minister Tony Blair, we have held extensive discussions about the specifics of the new social contract and its politics. Next month, after the G8 summit in Birmingham, we will hold another meeting at Chequers, led by the President and the Prime Minister. While President Clinton has developed a progressive politics in office, Tony Blair has had a model from which to learn before he assumed office. Many of the criticisms of Blair and New Labor, by the way, from both the left and the right, are exactly similar to those of the President. Among other things, the emergence of transatlantic one-nation politics makes it increasingly clear that far more than personality is at stake. It should go without saying that if we are to be an example to the world, we must be faithful to democracy at home. And now I will be more responsive to the question about Mr. Starr. We are plunged, at least in Washington, into a politics of defamation, a consuming world of innuendo, false witnesses, illusion, leaks, and smears. The abuse of the office of the independent counsel by Kenneth Starr is a transparently disguised attempt to destroy this presidency. The original intent of the office of the independent counsel was to remove it from politics. But Starr is profoundly political in his intent. The problem is not simply the largesse from Richard Mellon Scaife, the eccentric right-wing billionaire. Starr's numerous conflicts of interest, ideological and financial, his speeches at Pat Robertson's University, his alliances, brazen alliances, with individuals determined to inflict whatever damage they can on the president. It is not simply that he has assembled a crew of prosecutorial pirates with lengthy records of prosecutorial abuse and installed a chief deputy, Hickman Ewing, a religious fanatic who has proclaimed that he operates from a presumption of guilt. It is not simply that Ken Starr has jettisoned the language of law, speaking now of defilers of the temple, the apocalyptic rhetoric of a zealot, on a mission divined from a higher authority. The ultimate problem is that in his fervor, he is waging an assault on American rights, that he is engaged in an anti-constitutional destructiveness. He assaults freedom of speech and the right to petition the government. He has attempted to impose his very own Sedition Act. He abuses the grand jury to act out his personal temper tantrums and harass critics. He leaks with abandon in violation of grand jury rules, criminal rules, and legal tradition. He uses the instruments of intimidation and smear without restraint. Ken Starr is a figure whom the framers sought in their design to have rendered impossible, an inquisitor of unlimited, unchecked power. Starr, however, lacks any skepticism about his own certitudes, or even any sense of his unfamiliarity with criminal law. His lack of knowledge of the Constitution is glaring. His doctrine that the First Amendment is concerned with the truth is precisely the doctrine the First Amendment was enacted to prevent. But Starr is sure he knows the truth and that he should be its judge. His self-righteousness, his insecurity, his partisanship, his breathtaking hypocrisy have fueled an onslaught on rights that is unethical, illegal, and always political. Now he has appointed himself Grand Inquisitor for life. Ken Starr is on an endless quest, if not for vindication, then of vindictiveness. But I am certain that in historical retrospect, this perverse episode will be viewed in its proper perspective, as Jefferson viewed the Alien and Sedition Acts, in his words, a reign of witches. When we stand for liberty at home, we gain respect for ourselves around the world. There is an indissoluble link between the cause of democracy in our own country and abroad. Let us, John Quincy Adams admonished, not be unmindful that liberty is power. This was also an admonition for responsibility for those in a democratic government to use it to forge a social compact of general improvement that extends liberty. When we practice one-nation politics, we make the nation. When we make the future, we honor our true past. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Blumenthal. I would like to take the liberty of just asking a question and citing the obvious that there are two microphones here and people ought to come on up, and when you get to your turn, please give us your name, ask a question, and my brief one will be, can one assume that everything you've said about Kenneth Starr is a view shared by the President?
You can assume that I'm the assistant to the President.
Okay. Why don't you start? Give us your name and the question, please.
Hi, my name is Rick Grinnell. I'm a student here at the Kennedy School. You speak tonight of freedom of speech, and yet I am wondering how you reconcile suing someone for $30 million. And also, when you did this, have you talked to the Vice President about getting involved? Is this an administration suit, or is it your personal lawsuit?
Well, this question refers to my defamation suit against Matt Drudge, the internet gossip columnist. And it's an interesting story. You know, when I went to the White House, Marvin, my wife said to me, the day you have to hire a lawyer is the day you're out of there. And I hired a lawyer within 4 hours, which was a record. The day I entered the White House, the Drudge Report had a completely false report saying I had a history of spousal abuse that I was covering up. So I sued him. And it is my belief that I'm protected by the First Amendment, as defined by New York Times versus Sullivan, the greatest ruling for free speech in world history, which says that public figures, when defamed for knowingly reckless libel, not only have a right to sue, but can claim damages. There is such a thing as libel and slander, which is defamation, and that also defines what is protected speech. It is my own personal suit. I'm pursuing it with my wife. The president and the vice president have personally expressed their sympathy to me about the situation and the suit. And I'm grateful that they act decently as people, as well as in their official capacities.
Good evening. My name is Will Monahan. I'm a junior at the college. My question is simple. Do you think Ken Starr will ever bring an end to this investigation, and what do you think it's going to take to actually bring an end to it?
Yeah. Starr said he sees no end in sight as of last week. I take him at his word. I think it's entirely possible he will be a shadow on the presidency, even past President Clinton's tenure. It is my view that there is nothing anywhere, that there is no case. He has, in the Whitewater matter, one witness against the president with claims. David Hale, a convicted felon, conman, embezzler, swindler, who is now accused of being a tampered witness, having consorted with agents of Richard Mellon Scaife and having even accepted material things such as a car and cash. Eric Holder, acting on behalf of the Attorney General, he's the Deputy Attorney General, wrote Starr a letter strongly suggesting that he might have a conflict of interest in investigating this witness. Starr has responded by accusing the Department of Justice of having a conflict of interest. So Starr himself is now fighting with the Department of Justice over whether or not to investigate his only witness. That's where this investigation really is right now. In the Lewinsky matter, there is no case. There is no crime. There are no accusers. There's innuendo, and there are stories. And the case from which it arose has been thrown out by a federal judge as having no merit. So the materiality of this is non-existent. And yet Starr says the end is not in sight. So it's not for me to decide when to end this.
Yes, please.
Good evening, sir. My name is Tom Cotton. I'm a senior at the college. I had two questions, both pertaining to Mr. Starr. First, although you did not say the words in your speech this evening, you seem to be implying that Mr. Starr, as Mrs. Clinton has said, is the member of a vast right-wing conspiracy. I was wondering if Democrats Janet Reno and Eric Holder, who referred the matter to Starr, asked the matter to be referred to Starr, as well as Democrats Monica Lewinsky and Kathleen Willey, have somehow been subverted by this right-wing conspiracy. And second, you accused Mr. Starr of unethical, immoral behavior, and I was wondering if you consider it especially moral or ethical for you as a paid member of the White House staff by taxpayer funds to be defending President Clinton on private charges for, I presume, the alleged conduct which led to these is private and not a public matter.
The only grounds on which Ken Starr can bring a case against the president is abuse of office. Those are public grounds. That's a tortuous question, but if you're asking if I believe that there's a vast right-wing conspiracy, there's certainly, it's not something on which I have a theory, but only suggest facts. And I certainly think that the role of the SCAFE money ought to be looked into. It's now a question, one small part of it, that has lapped up on the only witness in the case. Ken Starr himself has numerous ties to the SCAFE operation. It's undeniable. He quit Pepperdine because it was funded by SCAFE. He's been associated with a number of groups that are funded by SCAFE, the Independent Women's Forum, for which he wrote an amicus brief on behalf of Paula Jones, which he never completed when he assumed his office of independent counsel. In and of itself, it ought to have been grounds for not taking the office under the sense of prudence and propriety. In itself, it is a conflict of interest. There are other groups as well, Federalist Society, funded by SCAFE, and so on and so forth. I mean, you can go through this sort of schematic list. Is there a right wing? Absolutely. Is it out to hurt the president? Absolutely.
Okay, thank you. Your question.
My name is Allison Camerata. I have a couple of questions about the AOL thing. Are you surprised that a judge dismissed your suit against AOL? And second, what would you like to see happen to Matt Drudge?
Yesterday, federal judge Paul Friedman of the D.C. District ruled in this case, this is an early ruling, on AOL's participation. And I was encouraged by his reasoning. He said if he were writing on a blank, the opinion is not widely circulated. I don't think very many people have seen it. He said if he were writing on a blank slate, he would rule in favor of the plaintiffs, meaning my wife and myself. And he said, however, that he felt handcuffed by the law passed by Congress, the Communications Decency Act of 1996, which immunized all content providers. The judge himself suggested it was a quid pro quo in his ruling. I think that those are interesting grounds for appeal, and I think that internet content providers ought not to be the only ones who act like publishers in the world who are not subject to the First Amendment. I don't think they should be removed from the Constitution, even by an act of Congress. In the matter of Drudge, I just want to see the system of justice work and go through this process. There is an additional process, if you're interested in this case, which involves discovery. He said he has had sources for this defamation, and through the discovery process, we may find out exactly how this was done. It seems to me to have been very much a political dirty trick.
Do you think that there's a place on the internet for gossipy, columns like his?
I think that there's a place for all sorts of speech for which there is wide latitude as established by New York Times v. Sullivan anywhere in this country, and that defamation is defamation.
Thank you.
Yes, please.
Hi, my name's Sarah Keel. I'm a second-year student at the Kennedy School and a longtime reader and fan of the New Republic and thus of yours. I have a question regarding actually Marvin Kalb's introduction of you. He described your interchangeable roles. You were a journalist and then you became an advisor to the president. And a recent Vanity Fair article claims that while you were a journalist, you took an active role in advising political candidates on policy and speech content. And I'm wondering if you could address these allegations and comment on what you feel the line is between being an objective journalist and an active journalist.
Thank you for the question.
Yeah, thank you. I engaged in all sorts of journalism. I worked for the Washington Post as well for 4 years, and worked for the New Republic, which is an opinion journal, and for the New Yorker, in which I was a sort of cross between a reporter and an analyst and a columnist. And I had, as I have now, many close friends with people in politics. And I talked with them, as many people in the press corps do, and shared social relations with them. I think these lines are much gauzier in general than people imagine. And I think it's important for people to know what your engagements are. And I tried to make clear always exactly where my beliefs, sentiments, and analysis lay. I tried to make it as clear as possible and tried to be as persuasive as possible about it.
May I have your permission to follow up on that question? I think what she's getting at, though, is shouldn't there be, in Washington but everywhere, some more clear line between a journalist and a politician? Because the people have to know whether
Right.
the information is reliable. So if you are, in fact, as this article alleges, Vanity Fair, providing political advice to candidate Gary Hart, to candidate Bill Clinton, and then writing about it, people can get confused. And I think that's at the heart of this question.
In my case, I think no one was confused about whatever I did. Some of the stories are apocryphal as well. But I think there ought to be clear lines, especially for established media, newspapers that purport to be completely objective, newspapers of record, and so on. But journalism is a large church, and there's room for opinion, analysis, commentary. And as we all know, Washington journalism, the lines are not indistinguishable, but people do socialize, they do know each other, and they do have relationships. They know secretaries of state, and they know people engaged in politics in the Congress. There was an age in which that sort of access journalism, if you will, was considered to have the highest status. The age of Lippman, Reston, and Alsop. And it seems to have flipped on its head in the post-Watergate era. But I think we're going to see a new journalism in reaction to Whitewater. While everyone seems to be reacting to the Watergate syndrome, I think there'll be a Whitewater syndrome as well. I think this will be the new...
Producing what?
Well, I think people are going to have to be very, very careful in the future about using anonymous, uncorroborative, single sources, about feeling, because of the pace of technology, the need to engage in this competition and put out things which are not fully checked, to rush to judgment on rumor and innuendo for fear of falling behind, and also for fear of being stigmatized by a pack that is engaged headlong in the pursuit of the prey.
Yes, please.
Hi, my name's Kurt Stevens. I'm over at Boston University. During the Reagan years, it was said that Speaker O'Neill and President Reagan could get together at 8 o'clock in the evening for a drink and put politics aside. It seems that in the last 20 years that there has been, that civil discourse has gone away and that we can no longer have a civilized discussion of the issues of the day. Instead, it resorts to name-calling. I mean, just recently, a Republican said some terrible things about the president, I believe, on the floor of the House.
Right.
And the same thing comes out of the White House, where they will attack the Speaker or Republicans from both sides. What do you see can be done to get us out of this vicious circle so that we can once again have a legitimate, civilized discussion of the issues, rather than attacking people's motives, their religion, and even their patriotism, as opposed to a discussion of where they stand, what the issues are?
I think it's a very important question. I would just say to begin with that nobody at the White House has ever attacked Speaker Gingrich personally, nor anyone else in the Republican leadership personally. But I think it's a very important question. You know, I believe last year both sides of the aisle in the Congress, the Republicans and the Democrats, went on a retreat together to discuss the possibility of establishing more civil dialogue. I think it's a very important question, and I think that part of it involves, it's a very complex question. It involves the nature of attack politics. It involves the utility of negativity in politics, because it's very useful. It works. And it also involves this new permutation in journalism, which gets harnessed by this sort of politics. I think it's very, very hard to disentangle all of these things. But I do think that reflecting on it and having a reflective element is essential. And I think it is part of a larger project of reestablishing civil society.
Thank you. Yes, please.
Hi, my name is Robert Walensky. I'm a senior at the college. I'd like to ask you a question about the recent trip the president took that you mentioned earlier. What do you see as a timetable and the prospects for expanding the free trade zone in the Western Hemisphere? And also, how do you feel the president's lack of a fast-track authority is going to affect that process?
At the Summit of the Americas in Santiago, the negotiations began for the free trade area of the Americas. We don't have fast track right now. We expect to have it in time to be able to enact a treaty when it's negotiated. We hope it's by the end of this administration. The deadline for FTAA is beyond this administration, of course. But this would be a notable achievement if we could do it sooner. And I think once we do negotiate it, that the Congress will be more receptive than it has been in the past.
Let's try to get in 2 or 3 more questions, and we want to end this at 8 o'clock.
Okay, this will be very quick. My name is Barbara Mack, and I'm from the Kennedy School. Marvin may have told you that we had Michael Isikoff from Newsweek here last week, whose recent forte has been in cocktail dresses. And he mentioned the irony of the fact that he's never been invited to Harvard, Yale, NYU, et cetera, in all his years of writing until the present time. So we had a good laugh about that. What I wanted to ask you is, do you have time in your schedule now to do any creative writing? And what your next projects as far as plays and screenplays might be?
Yeah. I wish I did. I'll tell you what, something about writing in this environment, which is that I'm an author, I'm a playwright, I've been a journalist for nearly 30 years, and I've written works of history. And I don't keep notes. And I'm somebody who would keep notes. This is a very unusual experience. I see a lot other people don't see. I've learned a lot. It would provide insight to other people. Memory is not perfect, but I cannot keep notes, nor does anyone else I know in the White House because of threat of subpoena. And I regard all of this as a real crime against history. So on that point, I feel that strongly every day.
Distinguished columnist.
Thank you, Bob Cutner, old friend of Sid's. A lot of the reporters who seem to have the most visceral hatred for Bill Clinton are people who are roughly on the same place in the political spectrum as Clinton. You did not have these kinds of visceral hatreds for Bush or for Carter, certainly, or even for Reagan, even though a lot of reporters were just disgusted with where he was taking the country. Why has this centrist, intelligent, charismatic, modernizing, centrist president been such a lightning rod for such hatred?
Well, your comment is incredibly interesting. And I think that there are members of the press corps right now who are engaged in independent, enterprising journalism on stories that are not PAC stories, not only about policy, but even about the so-called scandal matters. And I think that we're in a very interesting place in journalism where what you describe may be beginning to have run its course as not productive in any sort of way. either personally, professionally, politically, and certainly not towards the contribution to, as the previous questioner said, to a civil society.
See if we can squeeze in these two questions here.
I'll try to make it quick. If your hypothesis is, if I understand it correctly, that the president is popular because he's helped the American people adjust to new realities, then why is government as a general institution not trusted any more than it was 6 years ago?
Mm-hmm. This is an old conundrum of politics in America. And while esteem for government has risen, it's still in some disrepute. And what I think that you'll find is that the oldest study of American political science is correct. This was by Free and Cantrill, in which they found that if you asked general questions, Americans tended towards a more conservative position, but if you asked specific questions, they tended toward what they defined as operational liberalism at the time. I think that you'll find something very similar today. I think that when we discuss specific issues and from there talk about their benefit and where they fit into general progress, whether it's education, child care, health care, and environment, that people are very supportive. If we have a theoretical, abstract discussion, people respond as they have since the original study decades ago was taken.
The last question.
Hi, my name is Heather Thompson, and I'm a 1L at the law school. This is going to sound like a political question, but it's really not. This is a very personal and sincere question. As a person just starting out in my public service career, personally, one of the biggest concerns to me, if I ever do hold elected office or become very politically involved, is providing a good role model and a good, healthy environment for my community and the children in my community. My concern is that once you get to the level of the White House, is it possible to take those considerations into your daily decision-making anymore, or is it solely for personal political survival in order to make your day-to-day decisions and your reactions to the news and how you conduct yourself and how you present the issues?
I think almost the people I work with are very focused on the purposes of what we think of as helping the country, and we think of specific people. We're not zealots, we're not ideologues, and we're not, I think, completely removed from ordinary experience. We have families, we have children, and we have to deal with all the demands of life as well. You might find that in the White House, actually, these are even more pressing, dealing with, say, the issues of work and family, which are things we hold policy meetings about and try and work policies out about, which has contributed to the child care initiative. Today we held a huge child care event at the White House. So I'm not disillusioned about that by my experience at all. Nor am I disillusioned by my own experience. A number of people say, do you have regrets about this? And my feeling is not at all. While on the one hand, I've been defamed, I've been hauled before a federal grand jury, false stories have been spread about me, people write nasty articles. And it's not simply that is the price of public service and what public service has become today. Politics is a very contentious arena. And if you care about these things, then you have to be willing to bear that. But even more than that, it is worthwhile, in my view, to act on your convictions and what you believe in, and to have the experience of actually making those changes that do affect people's lives, and see that happen. I will tell you in one example, I was speaking to Marvin about this before I came out here. In Chile, had been working very hard in Latin America since last fall, before the president's trip, where in October the president directly raised the issue of freedom of the press in Latin America. This is not some sort of do-good, issue, the way it may sound here. There are a dozen journalists killed in Latin America this year. There are more than 100 killed in the last decade. Threats and physical intimidation are constant. There are laws of contempt for speaking ill of public figures. There's criminal libel, very different from civil libel. And while it can't be made perfect in Latin America, what can happen is what did happen, which is that some of the Americas, an effort I was involved in, we have helped create a new position within the Organization of American States, a special rapporteur for freedom of expression, who will monitor and call attention to violations of freedom of the press throughout the hemisphere. For working journalists in Latin America, and I spent a lot of time with them, this is something real. And it matters also for their societies and their democracies. Because, as I said, elections are not enough. You need the institutions of democracy to be supported. So I feel really proud to be able to have contributed in that way, and hope to make other contributions, as do other members of the administration, especially the President, the First Lady, the Vice President. And I find their example to have a really beneficial effect on everybody else inside the administration as well. So regardless of how it may seem, for those of us on the inside, we do feel we're making a difference. And I would encourage, at the Kennedy School of Government, people to think seriously about government.
Mr. Blumenthal, thank you very much, particularly for those last comments. Thank you.
Thank you, Mike.
And thank you all very much. Thank you all very much for coming out on this absolutely atrocious evening in terms of weather to listen to Mr. Blumenthal on behalf of the school. Again, thank you very much for being with us.
Thank you, Mike.
You want to take this over?
Yeah, I do. Smell like coffee.
That's a damn powerful stuff. I don't think you've ever laid into it.
I have.
Have you done?
Oh, yeah. I don't mind doing that. Here's the free fires of this one. Virtually.